Good morning, class. We're continuing with digestion. Actually, I have this lecture and a couple more, a couple shorter ones. And we've already talked about teeth and salivary glands and what's going on in your mouth as you bring food in. And now we'll continue as you're going to swallow it. It'll be a reflex. It'll go down your esophagus to your stomach. And then we'll see the digestion happening in the stomach. And it's going to squirt into the small intestine, where it's going to be hit by juices from your liver and your pancreas. And then small intestine is where the absorption of the nutrients is really going to happen. And we'll continue that in different lectures. But we'll talk about the liver and pancreas in quite some detail as well. All right, well, let's get started. So the food is going to be brought to the back of the mouth and swallowed. And we'll see the esophagus is simply going to carry it down to your stomach. And along the whole length of this gut tube, from mouth to anus, you have those four layers, remember? The mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and then serosa, or connective tissue out there. And the food has to be brought all the way through. Remember, it's not in your body, it's just in this tube where your body can work on it, and the waste can come out, and you can absorb into your blood what you want in your body from whatever you ingest. So this peristalsis is the movement along this tube. It goes just one direction unless you're vomiting. It's going, all the way through. And smooth muscle is different than skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle needs a nervous impulse to contract. Smooth muscle also can have that, or it can contract in the influence of hormones like oxytocin with childbirth, or just stretching. Physically stretching it will cause it to contract against that stretch too. So as the food, what pushes it down that tube is going to be that circular muscle squeezing it from behind, and the muscle ahead of it has to relax, and that will push that food in one direction. And so ahead of it, there's this wave of relaxation, and there's this wave of squeezing that'll move it down. And I'll show you a wave moving through the stomach in a video next. Another thing that happens is you want to churn the food up. It's called segmentation, where you have this squeezing in different areas that alternate along. And you see that picture there with the different, see the colors are by themselves, and here they're being mixed. So the segmentation, especially in the small intestine, will just keep, not a directional thing, it'll keep kind of mixing things up. And peristalsis will slowly move it along. And food will go hours and hours to get through your this digestive tract, and you need that time for chemical digestion, for absorption. So it's a slow process. It's pretty quick, just swallowing it, getting to your stomach, but then it takes hours in your stomach, then hours in your intestines. So you have time to really get all you need out of that food. So the food has been chewed in your mouth, mixed with saliva. And remember, your buccinator muscle in your tongue will keep the food pushed over the molars so you can grind it up, mix it with saliva. Remember, starches, carbs start getting digested chemically by salivary amylase. And then that ball of food called a bolus is pushed to the back of your throat by your tongue. So your pharynx is the location behind your oral cavity. And there's muscles and there's skeletal muscle. So you control it, but it's a reflex. Once that food hits the back of your mouth, you decide you want to swallow. The muscles work in a predictable fashion where the muscle will relax in the back of your throat, and then the longitudinal muscle will pull your pharynx up, and that will cause your epiglottis to cover your larynx, and then that pushed back food will be pushed down as the circular muscles constrict. They'll push the food down, and then your esophagus region will open up, and then that food will slide down. And I'll show you a picture of that here. The pharynx, first of all, don't forget, the oropharynx is right behind, but the nasopharynx is above that, and your epiglottis and soft palate will close that off when you're swallowing. So food doesn't go up, it goes down. Then your laryngopharynx will be the region below your oropharynx before that esophagus, which is normally just closed, but it will relax when you're going to swallow. And this goes through the whole swallowing reflex. you can take a look from that tongue. It fills your mouth, and it's going to push that bolus, that wet, chewed up food in a ball. It's going to hit the back of your throat, and then this reflex will happen. Your muscles have a memory what to do, and your larynx will rise, your epiglottis will cover over your windpipe, your soft palate will close at the nasal cavity, and the muscles, the constrictor muscles and the long muscles in your pharynx will move that, push that food down, and your esophagus will relax, and that food will slide down your esophagus. And once it hits your esophagus, it's going to stretch that, and the peristalsis will push the food down. And remember, gravity doesn't move the food down from your esophagus down to your stomach. It's going to be muscles. So you can stand on your head and swallow upward. It's going to be pushed up by the muscles. And here is going to be a movie. You can see this in an x-ray. So they gave the food something that's radio opaque, and so you can follow it.
Recording. Okay, video off. Recording. Okay, video off. Recording. Now follow it down, please. Sure. And back up. Okay, video off.
So on that video, it's pretty neat to see how where the food's going. Particularly when we look from the front, you could see that bolus of food or water come behind the heart. Comes behind the heart before it's going to pierce the diaphragm and get to the stomach. You could see the swallowing. You could see where the esophagus actually looked like it was curved a little bit. So indeed, you are chewing your food, and you don't usually think about it. You can if you pay attention, but it'll be mixed up and suitably broken down into smaller pieces in your mouth, and then the reflex, that swallowing reflex, happens, and the peristalsis will squeeze it down to your stomach. So make sure you know exactly what's happening when you swallow. It happens quickly when you're doing it, you're eating, you're talking, you don't really think about it, but how the food, that complex action, how it gets from your mouth to your stomach. And things can go wrong, then you can choke, and things can go down the wrong tube. They can come up the nose, you can have your epiglottis stuck, you need the Heimlich maneuver, but when things work, you're allowed to breathe, and then swallowing happens. Breathing has to pause, and then you can go back to swallowing. So this esophagus, it's about 25 centimeters or about 10 inches, and it's going to go behind your windpipe, behind your trachea, behind the heart, and then it's going to pierce that diaphragm to get into the abdomen. So there's going to be a hole, a hiatus, where the esophagus goes through the diaphragm. You can see, you guys know that the mucosa is stratified squamous epithelium, because you can swallow rough things like that. Submucosa around that, a lot of mucus glands, so things are lubricated, and then smooth muscle around it. It starts up actually technically some skeletal muscle, then it's smooth muscle by the end. Beautiful, you can see that muscular tube going behind, it'll be behind the heart and everything in your thorax, as you can see. Well, I can show you. That's what I'm talking about. So it's going to go behind this muscular tube, and normally it's closed, collapsed, until you're swallowing, then it opens up. So you see kind of the lumen there kind of has this kind of a configuration, but when you swallow something, it can stretch out and become, circular like that, but it collapses back down again. Now, an issue that can happen here is that hole or hiatus that the esophagus goes through just before it hits the stomach. that can come loose. And what can happen is that stomach can slide up and down sometimes. You can have this sliding hiatal hernia. We call it a hiatal hernia. A hernia is when any piece of your intestines or anything, even your brain can herniate. Something goes where it doesn't belong. It goes somewhere. And in this case, if there's pressure in your abdomen, that stomach can slide up where the hole in the diaphragm is. So a hiatal hernia happens. It's often when you lay down, it's worse because your guts will push that stomach up. Sometimes when you stand up, it'll slide back down again. And so I've seen this in a cadaver. We look at in the chest cavity, and there's all the stomach is pushed up into where the lungs should be. Very, very strange. And they can fix that. I've seen this also, this repair, where here is that hiatus or opening, and they can just reinforce it. I've seen like a plastic donut that's put right there too. So it keeps the stomach from going up. Hiatal hernia. Other hernias usually talk about down in your groin area, where a piece of intestine can push through into your leg or into your scrotum if you're a guy, if there's weaknesses there. So the esophagus is lined with this stratified squamous, like that. And there's just a dramatic change you get in your stomach. Your stomach will look at the epithelium, but it's just deep mucosa with all these glands, tons of mucus. And this mucus is alkaline because your stomach contents are really acidic, right? Highly acidic and corrosive. So the stomach needs to protect itself with this mucus. And your esophagus is not protected. So we'll see when some of that stomach acid goes up into your esophagus, it will burn. It will destroy that tissue. The stomach is a sac. Your book talks about it can hold 1 liter or more. It can hold more than 1 liter. You guys have been to buffets, things like that. You know that. This thing is going to store the food. So for an animal like a lion, it can go and gorge itself on pounds and pounds of meat and then go in the shade and slowly empty it and digest it. It hits that stomach acid, which is going to help kill some microorganisms. Not all of them, because you can obviously eat tainted food or water and get sick. Some bacteria can survive that path, but it's going to kill some things, kind of pickle it, and begin the digestion, especially of proteins. But it's a sac that can be small, or it can fill up if you eat a big meal. And then it's going to churn for 3 to 6 hours and then slowly empty into the intestines. There's not a lot of digestion going on. Digestion, yes, not a lot of absorption. So if you're going to hit it with acid, you're going to churn it, so mechanically bust it up and start digesting proteins, a little bit of fats, but you don't absorb nutrients really till you get to the intestines. Everyone's stomach's different. You look at cadavers, and it depends if it was a full or empty stomach, the shape of it and the size of it. Something peculiar about it is it has, instead of just the circular longitudinal layers of muscle, it's got an oblique layer. It's got a 3rd layer of muscle. And it's not really that impressive to see it, but especially up at the beginning of the stomach, there'll be that 3rd layer. So it gives it a little more strength, the stomach, and a little more churning ability. So it can, you saw that wave of motion, and you felt your stomach gurgle. It's that the pressure of the muscle will help churn this food and mix it, and physically as well as chemically start to digest it. Yeah, competitive eating contest. It's a sport, indeed, and it's not always the huge guy that's going to win it. Sometimes some of these slender competitors are way up there too. It just depends on how much your stomach can hold. And that's not. Sometimes size of the person is not as important as like physically what's going on inside there. The anatomy of the stomach, you can see, take a picture of it, and indeed, we call this first part right here the cardiac region, because it's by the heart. It's right below the heart. And that's what heartburn is. It feels like it's your heart, but it's not. And the stomach is higher than you think. It's up here. It's up higher, just below the ribs here. People often go, oh, my belly. They go down there where their belly button is. That's your intestines. Your stomach is up high just under your diaphragm. So it's higher than people think. So the cardiac region is that upper part, by where the esophagus dumps in. This expanded part on top here is called the fundus. The fundus is often where gases will form at the very top. It's the most superior part of your stomach. Most of your stomach is the body. And then you get the other region down at the other end is the pyloric region. Pyloric. Yeah. Because the sphincter at this end is going to be the pyloric sphincter. You're going to see really super thick muscle right there. As the pyloric sphincter, when it's closed, it keeps food in your stomach. And you keep doing this churning for hours like that, as long as that's closed. When that pyloric sphincter relaxes, it lets a little bit of fluid from the stomach squirt into the intestines. So it lets it out a little bit at a time. You don't churn it in your stomach and then open the floodgates and push it in the intestine. It's slowly let into the intestine where you can neutralize the acid and move it slowly along. And sometimes babies will be born, they keep throwing up. They can't move the food down. And they can have a hypertrophy of that pyloric sphincter and stenosis, which is narrowing. And they got to go in and surgically cut that muscle to allow food to continue on, past the stomach. When you look in the stomach, that's an empty stomach, you'll see these rugae or folds. When the stomach expands, those folds disappear. But you look at a stomach, it has these folds in it. You can see stomach. It's called tripe when you go to the grocery store. Americans don't eat a lot of it, but they sell stomach. You put in soups, things like that. True. So I talk about pyloric sphincter at this end. At the other end, there's a sphincter. It's not as impressive, but it'll be the lower esophageal sphincter, also called the cardiac sphincter too. And that keeps stomach contents from going back up the esophagus. So that is important as well. And remember, if I was to draw your diaphragm, right on top, right? And there's this hiatus or hole in the diaphragm. So your stomach is just below the diaphragm. Here's a radiograph. They can take a look at your stomach, and you see the pyloric region here, and the fundus is often hold gases in the top. It's kind of a landmark when you look at someone's radiograph. You can tell, oh, there's the fundus of the stomach, because it's often filled with air. So what's coming out of the stomach? One thing, it's freaking acidic. It's down pH, get down to 2. I mean, just wicked acidic. So hydrochloric acid definitely is coming out. Now, I'll show you a little video of how that's produced. And then the main digestive enzyme is pepsin. So pepsin breaks apart peptide bonds in a protein. So it takes a protein and it breaks it into smaller pieces. It's going to separate those amino acids. And if you were to make this in your cells, you might have some issues because it can break down like any protein bonds. And your cells got tons of proteins in them. So you actually make pepsin as an inactive precursor called pepsinogen. Yep. Remember angiotensin, the hormone that makes your blood pressure go up? In the blood, you had angiotensinogen, which is going to be converted into angiotensin to get to the active form. So kind of similar. Pepsinogen is made in the cells where it's safe. And then once it gets into the acidic environment, it's like taking the pin out of a grenade. Then it becomes dangerous. It's ready to go. It's ready to break up proteins. And the pepsin will actually help break up more pepsinogen. So it's kind of like a chain reaction. So pepsinogen is released into the stomach. The acids cleave off the part of it to make it that pepsin, which can break down proteins. And pepsin converts more pepsinogen like that. We'll see how you make a hydrochloric acid. And then tons and tons of mucus. This mucus, as I said, it's alkaline, so it's going to help protect the stomach from getting digested. Yeah, it's filled with acid and protein-busting enzymes. I mean, how do you keep that in your body, right? You want to break down the food. It also breaks down your stomach lining. So you can see your stomach lining is always renewed because it's being digested, really. And something that is important too, because you'll have people that have vitamin B12 deficiency. They'll become anemic. They can't make blood cells right. And the problem is not getting enough B12 in your diet. It's just that you're not absorbing it. And so you need what's called intrinsic factor. It is secreted into your stomach contents, and your intestines need it in order to absorb B12 from your diet. Yeah. So you see a B12 deficiency. It's rarely because you're not eating enough B12. It's a problem with this intrinsic factor that's not allowing you to absorb it. And finally, it's kind of hidden here, but you also have a gastric lipase. So you do start to break down some fats. It's a weird situation because the low acidity actually inhibits this. So why do you make it there? But you use this gastric lipase. It's about 30% of your fat breakdown. So 70% is done by the pancreatic lipase later on. But babies, it's a little more important to them. And if you have a pancreatic issues, the gastric lipase can help break down your fats, kind of take over the slack as well. So it's interesting. Yeah, and your stomach is not made for absorption. Indeed. I'll talk a little more about that. All right, a little history. We talked, in the very beginning, I talked about Galen and Da Vinci, things like that. Well, Beaumont was a physician that's really the father of digestive physiology. And spent some time in Vermont, you Vermont people out there. And as a doctor, he came upon a guy here that was working for the fur trading company. It's Mackinac Island. He was a fur guy, and he shot himself in the stomach with buckshot, and so he had a big rib injury and a hole. He thought he was going to die, but he survived. And but he was left with a hole called a fistula, as a hole here. Always, it kind of like just healed that way. And so Beaumont took advantage. He hired this guy as a helper, and he studied him. He would study digestion. He would take a chicken drumstick and tie it to a string and push it in the hole, and then take it out every hour and record what was happening to it. And so he did lots of experiments on digestion. And the cool thing is he would take a sample of the stomach acid juices and put it in a beaker, and he would show how digestion is purely chemical. It wasn't just the mashing up by the muscles. So that was new things he discovered. He looked at digestion with temperature and emotion. So he studied digestion pretty well, like that. Eventually, the guy with the fistula, he got better. He moved away, and Beaumont kept trying to get him to come back and work for him, but he didn't. But yeah, so that's how we learned about digestion. We still do this. Went to veterinary school. They have a big fistula in the side of a cow. They purposely made a hole, and so they could take samples of the stomach contents through time and different feeds and things like that. Oh, so characteristic, the histology, and you guys will do labs on this and take a look at the histology. It's a super thick mucosa because your stomach is making tons of acid and pepsin and call it gastric juice altogether. It's coming out of your stomach. So it has lots of deep glands in the mucosa making all this juice. It has a thick muscle layer as well, because it has to be strong, it has to churn your food. Yeah. And I'm looking at this electron micrograph, and I can see there'd be some holes right here. You can see they go deep into glands. So squirting out of that is this juice, this acidic pepsinogen-filled juice. And lots of mucus. So that mucus there, that mucus has to line it to help protect it somewhat from that rough environment in your stomach. Oh, close up, we're looking at this. You can see the mucus kind of spiderwebby on there. And you see those holes. Call those little holes, those are the gastric pits that empty into these glands that go deep in there that can make a lot of juice. So if you could see this, it would squirt out juice out of these holes. And these surface cells, you can see, are mostly up there. They're making mucus to help protect it. Gorgeous view looking at this. You can see how thick that mucosa is. And by having those long gastric glands lined by all these cells, you can increase your production, right? Instead of just being flat with a whole bunch of cells at the surface making juice, you have this deep pit so the juice can just be made by all the cells and squirt up out of there. So gastric pit, if you look on the top, are the holes, and they go into these gastric glands. And the glands are just going to be, this deep, long tube where all the juices will be squirted into it. So the mucus-producing cells will be at the top, and they'll go down a little bit. And then deep in there, you'll see two types of cells. We're going to see chief cells and parietal cells. And the chief cells make the pepsin. I remember it, but I just imagine the Chiefs, my favorite football team, they're all drinking Pepsi. So that's how I remember it. I don't care what you guys do. And then the parietal cells are the other ones that make the acid. Look at this histology. See all this beautiful region here? That's all just how glands that are going down and taking this tortuous path right and left as they come down, making all this juice that's going to squirt up on the surface. So yes, this gastric juice talk about, you can see what the constituents are. Pepsinogen is the safe form of pepsin. So pepsinogen does nothing, but the acid will cleave off part of it and make it into pepsin, which is the active form. And then HCl, hydrochloric acid. And you need, pepsin works in an acidic environment only. So you'll see once the food gets into the intestine and you neutralize that acid, pepsin doesn't work. So you're done with it. And then tons of mucus. Mucus is going to protect. And then don't forget that your stomach makes intrinsic factor, which you need to absorb the vitamin B12, which you need. And this juice comes out continuously, but at different rates. It's going to, when you guys are sleeping or not thinking about food, it's just a very slow flow. And then when you guys are eating or even thinking about food, the juices come out at a much faster rate. And we'll talk about that. All right, let's take a look at this video.
Hydrochloric acid is produced in parietal cells through a complex series of reactions. Carbon dioxide diffuses into the parietal cell, and the enzyme carbonic anhydrase catalyzes a reaction between the carbon dioxide and water.
We've talked about that.
Carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociates into bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion, and the bicarbonate ion is transported back into the bloodstream. An ion exchange molecule in the plasma membrane exchanges bicarbonate going out for chloride coming in. The hydrogen ions are actively transported into the duct of the gastric gland, and the negatively charged chloride ions diffuse with the positively charged hydrogen ions. Potassium ions are counter-transported into the parietal cell in exchange for hydrogen ions. The net result is production of hydrochloric acid in the parietal cells and its secretion into the duct of the gastric gland.
So very, very cool. Notice again that we make carbon dioxide to make acid. And we use that carbonic anhydrase is going to be the enzyme that helps with that, just like we did with the respiration. And then you have this called an alkaline tide after you have meals, because you're secreting hydrogen and chloride ions to make the acid in the stomach, and bicarbonate is exchanged for that chloride. And so you have a bunch of bicarbonate that enters your bloodstream as you're making acid, proportionally. And so you'll pee out a lot of bicarbonate after a meal. Yeah, so that's how you make acid in these cells. They're active, it takes energy, and you just pump hydrogen ions, and chloride goes with it. All right, your surface of your stomach and your intestines, that gets replaced constantly because it's such a harsh environment. It's filled with enzymes that are breaking down food, right? That is the same as the meat that makes up your body. And so the cells in your stomach, every few days, you can see that they're digested. And we'll see even in the intestines too, like every few days that all those cells are digested and moved on. So you're always making new ones. Deep in those pits, in those gastric glands, is protected from the stomach juices itself. So we'll take a look at that. The parietal cells, the ones that make hydrochloric acid, can last, look at that, a good part of a year. So it's those surface cells. The mucus protects it for a while, but then it just gets eaten away and replaced. So gastric secretions. First of all, you should know if I ask you, would be sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system that's going to cause more gastric juices to be excreted. Parasympathetic or sympathetic? What do you think? Parasympathetic. And you know what nerve that is? The vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is going to innervate the stomach, and when it is stimulated, releases acetylcholine, and the stomach is going to increase its gastric secretion. If you guys are going to fight or flight or exercise, and the sympathetic nervous system goes, it's going to inhibit your digestion. That's why you don't want to swim after a big meal. So the vagus nerve comes down, it's going to innervate the stomach, and the stomach is going to increase gastric secretions. And also, there's a hormone called gastrin, which you should know gastrin is going to cause more gastric juices to be excreted. So the stomach releases it, cells in the stomach release it into the bloodstream, and it actually just comes right back in the bloodstream, and it's going to cause more gastric secretions. Yeah, so food hits it, your nervous system and hormones are telling your cells to secrete more and more. And interestingly, what happens actually is that these parietal cells that make the acid, they are always being told to slow down by the somatostatin. So they're always being told slow down, kind of like your heart rate. Remember, it wants to go faster, your pacemaker, but the vagus nerve tells it slow down all the time. If you take your foot off the gas, it can speed up. Same thing here. These acid-producing parietal cells are listening to somatostatin, and when the vagus nerve comes to it, the acetylcholine is going to stop it or slow it down from making somatostatin. And so the parietal cells are like, no one's telling us to stop, make the acid. So you always have that kind of brakes put on until you take the foot off the brakes, and then these cells can make the hydrochloric acid. And also histamine is going to be released, is going to increase blood flow to the stomach, and it's going to increase all these secretions as well. So interestingly, this gastric secretion starts if you think about food, if you smell food, if you realize it's almost lunchtime or something like that. So we call that phase of this of digestion the cephalic, which means your head. So this is where it begins. When you're walking through the line, you're getting your food, and your body is preparing for this food to hit the stomach. This is cephalic. The gastric phase is when the food hits the stomach. And gastric means belly or stomach. And so the food is going to hit your stomach after you swallow it, and then gastrin will be released, your vagus nerve is going to say go, and it's going to just start ramping up those secretions so that you can start hitting that food with all the enzymes and the acid. And so it's going to stay in your stomach, like I say, for hours, and eventually it's going to be squirted into that small intestine, and that'll be the intestinal phase. And when it hits that, for a moment actually, the gastrin is going to increase your stomach secretion, but then it really quickly, hormones are going to shut it off, and so it's going to slow down. So once you start emptying your stomach, your intestines are going to say, okay, you've already secreted enough acid, and it's going to slow it down. And if your stomach gets super acidic, it also stops the gastrin too at a certain point, because you don't want to keep going, getting more acidic. So gastrin is going to increase stomach secretions, and that can be inhibited if the food is already reaching your intestines, it says slow down, or if your stomach is getting too much acid, it says slow down. We can take a look at this.
Regulation of stomach secretion is divided into 3 phases: cephalic, gastric, and intestinal. In the cephalic phase, the taste or smell of food, tactile sensation of food in the mouth, or thought of food sends nervous impulses to the medulla oblongata. These impulses cause parasympathetic neurons via the vagus nerves to stimulate secretion of hydrochloric acid and pepsin in the stomach. The parasympathetic stimulation also results in secretion of gastrin from the lower part of the stomach. This hormone travels through the bloodstream and further stimulates hydrochloric acid and pepsin secretion in the upper and middle parts of the stomach. In the gastric phase of gastric secretion, food has entered and distended the stomach. This distension activates a parasympathetic reflex via the medulla oblongata and also has a direct stimulatory effect on the gastric glands. The result is continued secretion of hydrochloric acid and pepsin. In the intestinal phase of gastric secretion, chyme has entered the duodenum, so gastric secretion is no longer needed. When the chyme contains lipids from the digestion of fats or contains enough hydrochloric acid to bring its pH below 2, gastric secretion is inhibited. The lipids and hydrogen ions inhibit gastric secretion by 3 simultaneous actions. First, they cause impulses to go to the medulla oblongata to decrease parasympathetic stimulation of the gastric glands. Secondly, they set up local reflexes via neurons in the wall of the gut that decrease gastric secretion. Thirdly, they cause the release of 3 local hormones which travel via the circulation to the gastric glands and inhibit their secretion.
It is true. That's a lot of good things. I noticed they mentioned chyme. I don't remember saying that word. When the food and whatever you're swallowing is going to hit your stomach, it's chyme is going to be the milkshakey, liquidy result of digesting your food. It's going to be what's in your stomach, that chyme. And that chyme, as it gets fluid, will be squirted into the small intestine. All right, you all saw that enterogastric reflex. Enterogastric. Entero is intestines, gastric is stomach. It's where the intestines tell the stomach, hey, we got the juices are coming in. Let's slow things down. Cool. And look at this. You guys know if you're upset, depressed, you're not hungry, you don't digest well, you kind of get a stomach ache. And we'll throw that on here too. But this is a nice take a nice view looking at things that are going to stimulate the stomach, gastric juice production, and inhibit it on the other side. So you can see that cephalic phase we talked about, just seeing food, thinking about food, smelling food, tasting food in your mouth is going to cause the vagus nerve to stimulate the gastric glands to make more juice. Then once it's in your stomach, of course, you're going to, just by local reflexes, you're going to make more gastric juice come out. And then you're also going to secrete gastrin from cells in the stomach that are going to go in the bloodstream and come back and encourage more gastric juices, make more histamine, make the stomach more active too. And then when it hits the intestines too, it's going to, that enterogastric reflex is going to go from the intestines to the stomach, and it's going to increase activity briefly. On the other hand, you can see, look at this, if you have a loss of appetite, your cerebrum is going to inhibit your vagus nerve, and you're not going to make much gastric juices. You can see if your stomach gets too acid, there's kind of a safety feature where you're going to inhibit gastrin so that you don't keep making it more acidic. And you can see emotional upset can make your sympathetic nervous system be stimulated, and that's going to inhibit digestion as well. And then enterogastric reflexes, going to be when things hit your small intestine, it's going to go back and it's going to cause the stomach to be less active. So, what kind of absorption takes place in the stomach? Not much. The stomach is designed for digestion, chemical and physical digestion, mechanical digestion. It can absorb water, alcohol, a few other things get absorbed through your stomach, but not much. And so after you eat a meal, your stomach is going to work on it. It's going to fluid actually can kind of take a shortcut. Fluid kind of just hugs this lesser curvature and it makes it right to the duodenum. And anatomically, this is the lesser curvature on this side. This is the greater curvature on that side as well. And the stomach will be will churn and churn the food and mix it with the enzymes and the acid. And eventually, once it feels like it's done, the pyloric sphincter will just open a little bit, and it only squirts out like a little bit, 5 or 15 mils at a time. And so your intestine's not overwhelmed. It's not like opening the barn door and the food leaves. It's just little bits are squirted out so that it can go on to the next phase. And fatty foods take longer than protein-rich foods, which take longer than carb-rich foods. So eat a fatty meal, it spends more time being churned and mixed in there. And some liquid, like I say, can take a shortcut and make it there very quickly through the stomach. Yeah, so when you read enterogastric, you think gastric is stomach. Okay, entero is your intestines. So this is food hitting your intestines that's going to tell your stomach what's going on. So it's going to go backwards like that. And that chyme that leaves your stomach is really acidic, and that would just burn through the intestines. So when the chyme reaches the small intestine, it's going to kind of burn it. It's going to kind of distend it. And that's going to cause hormones and reflexes that go back to the stomach that say, okay, slow down. We're going to slowly release your chyme, and we'll take care of it a little bit at a time. And the intestines can neutralize the acid, but not all at once, a little bit at a time. And it goes through the long 6 meters in your small intestine for absorption at that point. So when the food hits the intestines, when it's let out of the stomach, there's going to be a reflex back to your stomach, enterogastric. It's going to your intestines controlling your stomach. As I said, sometimes things can go the opposite direction. So vomiting is a reflex. That's a basic thing that we have that it's going to be in our brain stem or medulla, how we do this. And during vomiting, which can cause nausea it could be emotional, it could be a roller coaster, it could be ate something you shouldn't have. It's a way of your body getting rid of something this way. Interestingly, horses can't vomit. So if horses swallow something, got to walk them around and try to pass it through. But cows, in their hand, all day long they vomit. It's cows and sheep and giraffes and deer. They have multiple stomachs, and they bring the food up, they chew their cud, they swallow it again. So it's a whole kind of thing that they do. But if we wanted to vomit, you would take a deep breath. Your diaphragm would push down on your stomach. Your ab muscles would push down. You have to relax your esophageal sphincters. You want to close off your nasal cavity, and then this vomiting occurs. It brings it back up like that. And heartburn is not your heart. No problem with your heart. But the esophagus is right behind your heart, isn't it? Right when it goes into the stomach. So what it is a reflux of stomach acid, that chyme, up into your esophagus. And if it's a continual kind of thing, it can actually eat away at the esophagus and can even be life-threatening. There's a lot of blood vessels around there if it's an uncontrolled thing. But your stomach if you eat too much, you'll have a stomach ache. Your stomach will be distended. There's nerves going to tell you that. And this acid reflux that brings it up can be helped with antacids. You can take antacids that have aluminum, sodium, things like that. They're going to kind of really quickly lower the pH. And pretty much if you just don't binge eat and you eat smaller meals, some people, certain foods will increase this. Smoking, excess drinking can cause more of this heartburn. So there's various pharmacy products that can help with this acid reflux, as well as changing your diets. Yeah, mainly stomach ache is caused by overeating or eating some people spicy foods and such. And laying down is not so good either, because that's just going to cause your guts to push up, and your stomach contents can push up into your esophagus. If you're standing up, gravity somewhat will help too. That lower esophageal sphincter here, you want that to be tight so that stomach acid doesn't leak back up where it's going to burn that duodenum that is not protected like the stomach. Ulcers. Now, an ulcer is simply a hole. You can have ulcers many places in your body, but here we're talking about peptic ulcers would be in your stomach, or duodenal ulcers. They're holes that burn through and from infections, and obviously very bad, sometimes life-threatening. People think, oh, I get an ulcer because I'm so much stress at my job or school, things like that. And it's true, you could produce too much acid and cause ulcers, but it turns out we found out that almost all ulcers are a bacterial infection. This Helicobacter pylori lives in acidic conditions, and they'll give you antibiotics 95% of the time with an ulcer, and this will take care of it. And your book has a great story. People didn't believe this. It was a bacterial infection that causes ulcers. So the guy actually drank a bunch of gross swamp water and caused himself to have ulcers. That's dedication there. Beautiful histological view. So take a look at the difference between, here's your stomach. You can see it has a very thick mucosa, all those glands, right? But then here's the pylorus. You can see that the pyloric sphincter is caused by just real thickening of that smooth muscle. And it's circular, so it just leaves a little hole in the middle. And then your duodenum, look at how complex that is. It's going to have all these little fingers that come up to increase surface area. And this food in here, this chyme, is going to be really acidic as it comes into here. And so you're going to see, you put a bunch of juices in here to try to neutralize that acid. And that chyme will move along your intestines, really get worked at. Your pancreas, famously, we looked at it for its endocrine function, secreting insulin and glucagon. But most of your pancreas is secreting pancreatic juice. And this juice is going to go down a big duct and squirt into your intestines. So all this pancreas, they're in little groups, acinar cells, little groups like dead-end cul-de-sacs that are making juice that's going to come out of your pancreas. And this juice has enzymes for everything. Break down fats, proteins, carbs. Where do you see it? So that's where most of your enzymes come out of that pancreas. And it makes a lot of bicarbonate ions, which are going to neutralize that stomach acid. So you look at the pancreas. It has a head that's kind of tucked in your duodenum, the first part of your intestine, and it's got a tail that comes up. The tail comes all the way up to your spleen over there, and it's pretty big gland in there. It's stuck. It's retroperitoneal. It's stuck to the back wall, and there's this big duct that comes out, and that duct is going to empty in this little papilla. And if in gross anatomy, you cut open the duodenum and it looks like velvet in there, lots of little folds, and you kind of use your finger and you'll find this little nubbin, a little tiny hole in it. It's kind of covered in there. And that's this duodenal papilla, this little papilla. And inside of it's a little duct where that pancreatic juice will squirt out. And it turns out the bile duct from your gallbladder too is going to come to that same little nubbin and empty out. So that little duodenal papilla, that little hole, is going to squirt out pancreatic juice and bile into the food that's leaving the stomach right away. So it's going to hit it, neutralize the acid, help you start digesting fats and everything like that, because it gets hit, that chyme, right out of your stomach. And normally there's a sphincter here. Now, what do you want to call it? When I learned it was a sphincter of Oddi. Who's Oddi? No one knows. But now it just makes more sense to call it the hepatopancreatic sphincter, because hepatic means liver and pancreas. So it's the hepatopancreatic sphincter. And that's going to be closed between meals. And when food hits the duodenum, it's going to relax that sphincter, and your gallbladder will squeeze, your pancreas little myoepithelial cells will squeeze and push that juice. It will squirt out of that papilla right onto that chyme that's coming out of the stomach. All right. And one thing, because it's anatomy, you could interestingly have a gallstone like lodge right here, and will cause extreme pancreatic pain too, right? Because it's going to block up the fluid from the pancreas. And pancreatitis, incredibly painful. And if you have some of those enzymes in your pancreatic juice, they come out also with a safety cap on them, right? Like pepsinogen is the safe version. You're going to see other enzymes, the safe version. If that gets converted into the active form, it's going to start digesting your pancreas, and that'd be very, very painful. So what's in this juice? Enzymes to break down everything. Yeah, everything. In your spit, you had amylase to break down starches. Your stomach, you're going to have pepsin, which is going to break down proteins, and a little bit of lipase. Pancreatic juice is going to have amylase to break down starches, lipase to break down fats. These enzyme busting enzymes, I say protein busting enzymes, most important is going to be trypsin. But there's chymotrypsin and carboxypeptidase. And then nucleases to break down any DNA and RNA. That covers it, right? Nucleic acids, carbs, proteins, and fats. So everything in your diet. Pancreatic juice has enzymes to take care of it. And, of course, bicarbonate ions, those really squirt out just as soon as the chyme starts leaving the stomach. You neutralize that acid. So pancreatic juice that comes out at first is going to be just very watery, filled with bicarbonate ions to help neutralize that acid. And it's going to, the pepsin that had been working before is going to be inactive because it only works in acidic environment. So pepsin worked in your stomach, and then when it gets into the neutral environment of your intestines, it's going to stop working, and these other ones will take over. So trypsin breaks down amino acid bonds, and with these other two, it makes sure it's going to break down all of them. And you'll notice, again, trypsin I mentioned, but it says trypsinogen on the slide. Well, that's the inactive version. Same thing with the other two. Those are going to be inactive versions that will be activated once it gets into your intestine. Pancreatic amylase, just like you had salivary amylase, it's going to break down carbs. And then lipase is really going to get to work on the fats. And we'll see breaking down fats is a little more complicated because oil and water don't mix. So the fat wants to lump together. It's not going to dissolve in the watery juice. So we're going to see that bile salts from the pancreas are going to make the fats into little globules. And then this lipase can work on breaking down the triglycerides into the fatty acid parts so they can be absorbed. Oh, here we go. I didn't know if it's this slide or not, but what actually breaks down trypsinogen that's being secreted is an enzyme that the intestinal wall produces, enterokinase. So trypsinogen is the safe version that can be made in the pancreas. It doesn't digest itself. And it goes into the intestines where enterokinase, which is going to be on the walls, will turn it into trypsin. And that trypsin will further convert more trypsin into trypsin, just like we had in the stomach situation. Yeah, and that's going to, the trypsin will convert the other two too, chymotrypsin, the other one. Whew, it's a lot to talk about. The pancreatic juice, the bicarbonate ions are neutralizing, and then you have this amylase, lipase, protein busting enzymes, nucleases. Now, what's going to make your pancreas secrete this juice? It doesn't want to do it when you're just between meals. That'd be a waste. It just wants to squirt out when that chyme hits the small intestine, when you need to start digesting it. So that chyme that's entering from the stomach, wicked acidic, and it's going to start burning the inside of your intestines, and you're going to have nervous reflex that goes back to the stomach, and you're going to release a hormone from the intestine wall called secretin. And secretin hormone is going to go in the bloodstream, and that's going to go to the pancreas and say, dude, we got food coming. We need to secrete that pancreatic juice, and it's going to cause a squirting out of this bicarbonate-rich water, which is going to neutralize that acid. So secretin, released by cells in the intestine, goes in the bloodstream. When secretin hits the pancreas, it makes it squeeze out juices. And a second enzyme, hormone, you have secretin. The other one is called, we call it CCK, cholecystokinin, and that's also going to cause the pancreas to shoot out more juice, and it also is going to affect the gallbladder. It's going to cause it to squeeze, so it shoots out its bile too. So secretin is going to work on the pancreas, and then CCK is going to work on the pancreas and gallbladder So all of that is getting the pancreas and gallbladder to secrete out their juices to begin this digestion. You don't want it to happen between meals. You want it to happen just as the food reaches the intestine. So that's what happens here. All right, so a little complexity there, a lot of enzymes, how we're doing the chemical digestion I talked about. This is a cool view. It just shows this is your duodenum, or the first part of the intestine I'll talk about. And this will be the pyloric sphincter, the stomach above. And the food is going to get hit by these juices from both the pancreas and also the gallbladder too is going to also secrete juices in the same spot. Here we have a little accessory duct. Sometimes there's an accessory little papilla, but here's the main duodenal papilla where the pancreatic duct and the bile duct are going to squirt out the juices into this watery kind that's coming down from your stomach. All right, till next time.